So our speaker this afternoon is Sister Ephrem Hollermann, and she's been a sister here for a while. She can tell you if she wants to. She teaches in the history department, but or theology department. She took a decade off to be prioress. Yes, from 1995 to 2005. But she's back in the classroom now, and I just found out that she's retiring at the end of this academic year. So good for her, but she's working. She can tell you what will be working on. But I think with that, we'll let her get started, and feel free to ask questions. I think we'll save them for the end, but we'll unless there's something you really have to know while she gets going here. So would you welcome Sister Ephrem?
Thank you, Chick. Thank you for inviting me again. She invited me last year, and I ended up flat on my back with a with a sciatic nerve, inflamed sciatic nerve, so I wasn't able to do it. So thank you for pursuing me again. And I am happy to be here. Who are the people who are on this year's upcoming tour? Okay, that's a really good representation. I have a few slides to begin with.
Do we need the lights down? Or the slides?
Is it okay?
It's okay.
Okay. I have a few slides to begin with, and then I'm going to do a quick history. One of my friends said to me, "They've given you an hour. You are not capable of doing the history of St. Walburg Abbey and Eichstatt in an hour. So you're going to have to exercise great discipline in cutting things down." So I've tried to do that. I have a few slides to begin with, just to give a little ambiance to the history. And then I want to run through the history that I think is relevant in terms of the image of our grandmother house. And then I'm going to come back to some slides that some of you will recognize. Chick shared with me the file, part of the file of photos from the Benedictine tours over the last 5 years. And I had great fun looking through those, and I've used some of them. And so the last part of the presentation will be running through these slides rather quickly. I know that it's really tedious to go through somebody's album of pictures, but I've picked out some that I think you're going to experience. You might want to have a glimpse of those to begin with. First of all, on this slide, this was a picture taken by Dan. Is he here? Did you say he was from the 2013? Yeah. It's a hodgepodge of photos that I put together here, but for those that I could identify, I put a name on them. But I want you to take a look at the tower. Is there anything on our campuses that resembles the architecture of that tower? Specifically on the St. Ben's campus? Pardon?
The library.
The library. It's really intentionally designed from the Tower of St. Walburg Abbey in Eichstatt. The only thing it doesn't have, and what probably makes it a little difficult to recognize, is it doesn't have the sphere on top with the golden statue of St. Walburga. Just a couple other slides. Some of them are my favorites. Now see if I'm going to do this right. I know I wasn't going to do this right. That's not the one I want. There it is. That's not a very good picture. Some of these are before digital photos that have been scanned, old photos. And the color isn't good on this, but this is one view of the Abbey, founded in 1035, so it has a very, very long history, as many of you know. This is another one taken by Dan. I like this because you can see it nestled into the hillside with the greenery behind it, and the color is really great on this. This is actually my favorite one, but it's taken from a postcard, so it's not a very good picture. But I love it because it shows the Atmu River. Lisa, am I saying that correctly? Yeah. And it also gives us the sense of it being built into the hillside, surrounded by a lot of greenery. But actually, they're pretty much right in the heart of the city. You can get to the main courtyard of the city and then just walk up the stairs to the Abbey. And this one, Carol Johannes took. I think she was on the first tour. Yeah, also. And of course, it's an idyllic picture of the area. But it's pretty true to the way it looks in the summertime. It's just a lovely location. I'm not going right. I'm going to stay here for a little bit. Approximately 46, I've called it a grandmother's legacy because it is the grandmother house of St. Benedict's Monastery here in St. Joseph, Minnesota. But approximately 46 North American Benedictine women's monasteries today trace their founding to St. Walburg Abbey in Eichstatt. I say approximately because that's a 2009 number. In the past 5 years, there's been a trend of mergers. And so right now there are some Benedictine women's monasteries in this country who are in the process of merging with other monasteries. For instance, St. Benedict's Monastery took in the community from St. Bede in Eau Claire, Wisconsin 2 years ago, and then the community in Ogden, Utah just a little over a year ago. So there are mergers happening across the country, but I think it's pretty close still to 46 monasteries that trace their origin to St. Walburg. St. Benedict's Monastery, founded in 1857, is second generation from Eichstatt in this country. Having been founded from the first Benedictine women's monastery in this country, which is St. Joseph Monastery, St. Mary's, Pennsylvania, which was founded in 1852. So on this tree, the main trunk is St. Walburg Abbey in Eichstatt. I've highlighted the St. Benedict's Monastery, St. Joseph, Minnesota branch. The first foundation, and I won't go through the whole chart, but the first foundation, reading from the bottom right, was Mount St. Scholastica in Atchison, Kansas. And then, as you see, it branches out then into 3 other monasteries that they founded. So the way Benedictine communities happen is through a sort of organic kind of development. When the membership gets large, when it gets too challenging to sustain and maintain a community life with a large number of people, then there is a kind of natural, organic way of sending a group out to establish a new monastery in another place. Now, St. Benedict's Monastery here has been untypical of Benedictine monasteries of women throughout the world because our membership, twice in our history, reached over 2,000 members. So we were well able to send out sometimes 80 to 100 sisters to establish other foundations. Now, just a word about my background. I'm a church historian by training, but my research specialty has been in American Benedictine women's history, and it began about 28 years ago with my doctoral dissertation. My study was concerned with the adaptation of the women who came to this country and established a monastery and took in membership over the first 30 years. And what I wanted to analyze is the transitional dynamics that happened as this European style of Benedictine monastic life was transplanted on the American frontier. So that was the essence of it. If you want that whole story, it's in my 1994 book. This is a bit of shameless promotion here. But we still have about 400 copies of it. And this is both tracing the organic nature that you see in the highlighted portion of this chart, as well as the analysis of the dynamics of adaptation between the European model and the American model. If you're interested in receiving a copy of the book, I can get it to you for a free will offering. You can let Chick know, and I can pass the books on to her, and we can distribute them. That's the whole story. So that's what I'm trying to condense, because I spent 10 pages on just a very general overview of the history of St. Walburg Abbey, because I really wanted to get to the business of analysis. There's another book that some of you who have been on the tour probably received copies of. I think it's 2010 or 2011 book by the sister who's the archivist by the name of Zunker. This is a 900-year history in a slim little volume. So we really don't have the definitive 5-volume history of St. Walburg Abbey, which probably will never be written, but it should be written. Now, a little bit about the history, the early history of the Abbey. It was founded in 1035, and it was founded by royalty, at least those who had political rank in Germany. It was founded under the auspices of a count with the backing, a count meaning a political leader in Germany of the time, having the backing of the Bishop of Eichstatt. And it has a very interesting origin because the first group of women that came together there to form the community came from 3 different places. There were single canonesses, single women who weren't really nuns as we know them today, but they were canonesses who had dedicated their life to taking care of the tomb of St. Walburga in Eichstatt, a revered Bavarian saint who lived in the 8th century. She had been an abbess of the monastery, the abbey in Heidenheim, and died there, but she had family connections in the places where they landed, and particularly in Eichstatt. So eventually her remains were brought to St. Walburg Abbey in Eichstatt. Now, the first community was made up of some nuns from Nürnberg Abbey in Salzburg, and for the sake of the students who are going abroad to Salzburg, I just threw in this slide. I just tossed this in. It's not a very good picture, but are you going to take your students to Nürnberg Abbey, Lisa?
Oh, for sure.
For sure, of course. Okay. So some canonesses, some of the nuns from Nürnberg, and Benedictine nuns from 3 other monasteries that were situated along the Danube River. And the first abbess was from Nürnberg. I'm going to move real quickly. I'm going to take like 200, 300-year leaps through this history from 1035 onward. In the early medieval period, there's not much to say. The first few years are really shrouded in a kind of darkness, and that was, fairly typical of that period in European history. But it seems that material goods and possessions increased considerably, and that is because of the women's connection to the nobility. However, by the 15th century, there was a definite decline in discipline. It was said that the convent resembled an institute, and this is a quote in the 900-year history, the convent resembled an institute for fashionable women of the world, rather than a spiritual family according to the rule of Benedict. In the year 1456, this year is often referred to as the year of reform by the Bishop of Eichstatt, backed by the Pope. Reform was needed because of the decline in monastic discipline. Now, this reform that was suggested by the bishop, and this is an old story, I think, met with resistance from the nuns. It was imposed upon them. They were to do this and not to do that, and of course they resisted because there's also a long tradition of canon law that says churchmen cannot interfere with the internal affairs of women's communities and monasteries. So it met with resistance, and eventually the dissatisfied nuns left, and the old guard rose up, and the old traditions of St. Walburg were restored. So the reform was really a good thing. Bishop von Eyck really had the spiritual welfare of this community at heart. During this period of reform, their income increased, the community doubled in size. These factors enabled the community to pass through the really difficult years of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century without suffering the kind of decline that many of both men and women's monasteries during the Protestant Reformation suffered. Now, nearly 200 years later, another leap. In the 17th century, this is probably the darkest period in their history. You know, as I read the chronicles, you know, even darker than what they suffered during the Protestant Reformation. But in the year 1633, the convent suffered devastation during the Swedish invasion of the city of Eichstatt. They endured a 3-year period of war, misery, plague. And the Swedish War was part of the 30 Years' War that was going on in Europe of the time from 1618 to 1648. And there are some rather poignant episodes in the chronicles about this invasion in 1633. The Swedish troops attacked St. Walburg Convent itself and then remained inside the walls for what they refer to in their chronicles as the 7 days of horror. The abbess, the reigning abbess of the time, was dying at the time, and it was said, and this is recorded in their chronicles, that the soldiers actually stomped on her body as the sisters were at her bedside praying for her. The soldiers plundered the convent, intimidated the nuns, set fire to the convent and town. And it's also mentioned in the chronicles that some of the nuns escaped to the river, the Apmu, to avoid being raped, and so they lived in the river virtually for several days. Eventually, the nuns were rounded up and taken as prisoners, and they were moved from Eichstätt to Regensburg, where they were held for bail for approximately 2 weeks. As soon as they were able to return to Eichstätt, they began the restoration of the convent immediately. There's a steady theme through the story of these strong, committed, dedicated, undaunting women who pick themselves up, brush themselves off, and move forward. They were able to secure funds from the government of Bavaria, the government of Austria. The reconstruction after the Swedish War actually took 12 years. But by that time, interestingly, the community had grown to 40 members. The remainder of the 17th century after this episode was characterized by the work of rebuilding, but then beautification and expansion. There was this tradition of the richness of culture represented at this abbey. One historian writes that the previous turbulent century gave the house its external form, as well as an interior spirit of self-sacrifice and mutual charity, of fidelity to one's vocation, of hospitality and generosity. Those are the spiritual values that seem to run through this history, through the chaotic times, as well as the times when things were going well. Now, this is bringing your experience closer to home, those of you who haven't been there yet, but it was really the 18th century which was responsible for much of the church ornamentation that exists today. And I'll show you some slides of that church ornamentation. With the passing of another 200 years, there was a new crisis and a new challenge. There's something about 200-year periods in this history that fascinates me. And I try not to read too much into it, but it's there. The evidence is there. So what I'm talking about here is the dawn of the French Revolution. And that brings the whole story closer to home as well. The French Revolution beginning in 1789 and lasting through Napoleon's dictatorship. Actually, Bavaria was loyal to Napoleon during the early years of the French Revolution, and they were somehow rewarded in that their country was raised to a kingdom under King Maximilian I. The tragic thing is that Maximilian's chief minister was extremely hostile toward the Catholic Church, and many of you may know this history of the French Revolution. There were state decrees, and I'm going to talk about it just in relationship to the monasteries. There were state decrees in 1802 and 1803 that mandated the secularization of all the property belonging to monasteries. These properties were given over to the free disposal of the respective rulers of the provinces and the sections of the cities. Now, the dispossession of church property was carried out in a very ruthless and heartless manner under Montgelas. The residents of the monasteries and convents were driven out of their homes abusively, and their properties were pillaged and destroyed. As a result, religious life in Germany was practically wiped out. And there were hundreds of monasteries of men and women throughout Europe at the time. According to some estimates, the secularization, meaning the government's invasion and claiming property, the secularization in Bavaria affected about 3,000 monks and 2,000 nuns. Now, interestingly, St. Walburg's Abbey escaped the consequences of those early decrees of secularization. They weren't immediately subject to the decrees. But in 1806, under another decree, St. Walburg's passed into the hands of the government, ending a century and a half of material progress and a vigorous, wholesome religious life. There was a woman who was prioress at the time. I want to do some more work on her. Her name was Michaela Morash, and I don't know if she was mentioned at any point in your tours, but she was the abbess during part of this period of secularization, and she was a really savvy woman because she took the approach of becoming friends with government officials because they now owned her property. And she didn't waste any time in making friends with the Bavarian rulers. She was especially kind to Josephine, who was the wife of Napoleon, and hoped that through her influence, she could assure the benevolence of Napoleon in relationship to their monastery. The chronicles say that she gave baked goods from the abbey to these politicians and these rulers, and she would wish them a happy birth, send them a letter for their birthdays and name days, the days on which they celebrated their birth saints. However, by 1806, the 34 nuns who were living in the monastery at the time of that decree of secularization were asked to leave the monastery buildings and property. And again, repeat of an old theme, they refused. They refused to leave. Get a picture in your mind of 34 nuns, their hands under their scapulars, saying, "We will not go." One account recalls that each sister was questioned individually if she wished to remain in the house, and each of them answered, "Yes, I will remain, I will not go." Almost miraculously, I think, the government conceded, allowing them to remain in their buildings until they died out. That was the condition. And these were the qualifications, that all of their possessions, their buildings, their property belonged to the state. They were forbidden to receive new members. The government actually set up their daily schedule and, of course, didn't allow them to live their religious community life. The government officials checked up on them periodically to see if the schedule was kept, gave them a small pension to live on. Now, at some point, this abbess, Michaela Morash, found out that other sisters in secularized convents were receiving higher pensions than they received at St. Walburg. And she managed to obtain 4 increases in their pension in the years between 1806 and 1818. Do you see why I want to do more work on her? But she died during the period of secularization, and she was only 68 years old when she died. Now, next to nothing is known about how the nuns really lived together during those secularized years, but I find it extremely interesting to speculate about what aspects of their religious life they sustained when the government officials weren't looking. One account reports that a strong spirit of unity saved the monastery from being completely destroyed. I've thought about, it's interesting to note in their chronicles that by the time the abbey is restored, and I'll get to that in a moment, somebody's already the prioress. So there must have been, when Michaela Morash died, there must have been some handing on of leadership underground, which is very believable to me in what I know about how monasteries function. The first great wonder of this part of the story is that by the time King Ludwig, who was favorable to the church, came to power and initiated proceedings to reopen the monastery in 1835, 13 of those 34 women were still alive and eager to begin anew, and they were old. They had survived the period of secularization. They were ready to start over again. King Ludwig was a benevolent and cultured leader, and he was interested in the revival of monastic life in Europe as a whole. There were only about 20 European monastic houses out of hundreds of them that survived the Napoleonic period. About 76 men and about 76 monasteries of men and 7 monasteries of women were destroyed in Germany alone during this period. About 3 years prior to the restoration of St. Walburg's in 1835, the Bavarian government posed some options to those 13 elderly nuns who remained. They said that they could reopen and they could rebuild their community life under one main condition, and I bet you can guess what it is, that they be self-supporting. Don't depend on the government. You've been receiving a pension, but now you're on your own. And they were given 3 options by the government. I love this part of the story. The first option was they could be self-sustaining by earning money with votive candles and selling the holy oil of St. Walburga, which I'll get to later. Well, essentially, they said, over our dead bodies. The prioress at the time wrote this, and this is a quote from their chronicles. "The holy oil of St. Walburga is not sold, nor ever was sold, and it never entered our minds, and I hope it will never enter the minds of our successors, either to seek or to find in the dispensing of this sacred oil of St. Walburga a temporal monetary advantage." So there. That one was out. The second option was to manage the brewery again. Again, the prioress wrote, "The working of the brewery was real service only at that time when the monastery was in full vigor," because they had a brewery in their past history. "Now for the people of Eichstatt, there are enough breweries within and without the city, so that it is neither necessary nor advantageous to start a new one." So 2 of their 3 options are gone. And the third option was to entrust the girls' school of Eichstatt, the state school, to the nuns. And that was the option that they chose. And that's the beginning of this communities, in the American communities of Benedictine women. This is the beginning of their history of education. Up to this time, the nuns had been enclosed, contemplative, had no outside works. And with the reopening of the school, or staffing the school in Eichstatt, began a tradition that came to America and sustained the life of Benedictine sisters in this country. And then what followed after the I'm almost finished here. What followed after the Restoration in 1835 is, to me, an astounding sequence of events. The decree of restoration came from the government in July of 1835. Just 4 months later, they received 3 new members. So they didn't waste any time repopulating their ranks. A year later, the Eichstatt School for Girls opened under the auspices of St. Walburg's. But, the chronicles say, the early years of the Restoration were uneasy. According to the 1900th anniversary historian, and this is a quote, and you can imagine this, there was strain in the relationship between the faithful older members, who had borne every disappointment and want, and the younger, energetic, and progressive sisters, whose particular duty was building up the school. You can imagine the old guard and the new wave trying to live together and trying to build something new together. It's important to our story. What is important to our story is that during these early years of rebuilding for St. Walburg's, the post-French Revolution German Catholics were leaving for North America in very, very large number. The German Catholic immigrants were increasing by leaps and bounds in this country. In spite of the early uneasy years of the Restoration, their membership steadily increased, so that within 17 years after the Restoration, they were able to send 3 sisters to begin again in North America, and that's where our story begins. 3 members who entered St. Walburg's in 1839, 1844, 1847 were to become the North American foundresses. But imagine this. Within 13 years after Restoration, all of the older members had died. So the community had lost 13 members to death in 13 years. The 25 members who remained were all of the new wave, none of them having experienced the old way of life. And all of them involved in the new work of education. So it was really a new day for this ancient monastery. This was an immense shift from no outside works, from an enclosed style of life, to works outside the monastery. Now, bringing us even closer to home, and I'm not going to go on very much longer here. I apologize. I'm interjecting things I don't have in my notes. St. Walburg's early interest in the American mission had a variety of sources, which of course we can't get into here. But the source of interest closest to our founding happened in 1846, when Boniface Wimmer from St. Michael's Abbey in Metten, Bavaria, along with his companions, set sail to establish the first Benedictine monastery of men in North America, St. Vincent Abbey in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And a mere 5 years later, in 1851, he petitioned St. Walburg's for sisters to come to Pennsylvania. There was this pattern that developed immediately. The monks would establish parishes, and then they would establish schools, and then they would petition Europe for sisters to come to teach in the schools. By the way, St. Vincent's in Latrobe, Pennsylvania is the founding monastery, the grandfather house of St. John's Abbey. In 1851, he made that petition, and the prioress at the time, Edvarda Schnitzer, refused Wimmer's first request, and she had 2 reasons for refusing that. The prospect of a mission in America seemed too foreign to their life and tradition of strict enclosure, and she didn't even know what the wilds of northern Pennsylvania were like in the 1850s. And her second reason was St. Walburg's was still burdened with initial difficulties of having taken over the local girls' school only 15 years earlier. It seemed impossible not only to free teachers for the new mission, but also to find replacements for them in Eichstatt. But a year later, after another request, she consented in these words, quote, "Even though I could do this only at a sacrifice for my convent, which is only now beginning to flourish, I gave my consent, and the more gladly, convinced by the permission and the approval of our Right Reverend Lord Bishop. I saw in it the working of divine providence, and I hope not without reason, but that with such a sacrifice on our part, the good Lord will reward our convent and all its members, and will fill them with enthusiasm for their own vocation." Unquote. At this time, the community numbered about 42 women, so they were receiving new members rather rapidly. So it was on June 12th, 1852, that Mother Benedict Reep, the foundress of St. Benedict's Monastery, Walburga Dietrich, and Mara Flieger left their beloved St. Walburg's to establish the first community of Benedictine women in North America. It is St. Joseph Monastery in St. Mary's, Pennsylvania, which is our mother house, our founding house. Now, as I mentioned that name, St. Joseph Monastery in St. Mary's, Pennsylvania, I'm weeping inside because on January 13th of 2014, they announced that they are closing. They have 17 members. They're not able to sustain themselves. So they need to close their monastery and transfer to other monasteries throughout the country. So it's a historic moment for us. And I'm part of a committee that is trying to plan some memorial site that will keep that legacy, our founding legacy in this country, alive. And that's another story. Now, Mother Benedict Reep, who I've done considerable research on, but there isn't much about her because she died very young. She was the leader, the superior of the group, and she would die of TB in St. Cloud within 10 years of her arrival in North America. And she was only 36 years old when she died. But within those 10 years, she was responsible for establishing 6 new communities. In St. Mary's, Pennsylvania, in Erie, Pennsylvania, in Newark, New Jersey, in St. Cloud, the first monastery, our first monastery was founded in St. Cloud and then moved to St. Joseph 6 years later. One in Covington, Kentucky, and one in Chicago. Now the rest of the story, that story, you can find in the Reshaping of a Tradition. So I know that it's even more than you bargained for. You may feel that you've been taking a drink from a fire hydrant, but there is a lot more. I want to go to the remaining slides, and I'm going to go through these quickly. What time is it? Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, these are photos from a variety of places, scanned from older photos before the digital age, from books and postcards, from the Benedictine Heritage Tours of 2012 and 13. Carol Johannes, who is my office manager in the theology department, when she went on the tour. And then a few at the end are a handful of my hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And I haven't identified credits for all of them, and I'm really a stickler about credits, but this was very quickly done. But the ones that I could identify, I did. Oh, I'm not going to use that. When you arrive in Eichstatt, you'll be pretty much at the base of a hill and in the center of the city, those of you who are new to the spot. And you'll be walking up a flight of concrete steps. And this is the main entrance doorway you will come to. The other door is very significant in our history, and I'm sure whoever's going to greet you there is going to point this out, that the brown and yellow door was the door through which the first 3 sisters who came to this country passed. And so they're very quick when they have American sisters or people with connections to American sisters to point that out, that this is the door, and they have retained it as it looked in the middle of the 19th century. Above the door is a very familiar image of St. Walburga. She's depicted with a staff with a crown, signifying her nobility in the 7th, 8th century. And then also holding a book with a vial of healing oil, which I'll speak about when I show you the slides of the shrine. This is the entryway where you will be greeted, most likely. This area right here is the reception desk where the regulars, sister on duty, greets visitors. I threw this one in because this Sister Cecilia there was on the first tour, and she's being greeted by the current abbess, Francisca Cluse. And I'm going to talk more about her, show you some more pictures of her in a little bit. She's a probably the first place, and you can correct me, probably the first place they'll take you is into the parish church. And this would be the entrance to walk up into the parish church. And this is the interior of the parish church. And as I mentioned in the history, that most of the beautification that you're going to see in their buildings happened in the 18th century. But of course there have been some modern day renovations, like that entrance is a relatively new entrance. We were looking at the main altar as we walk into the church. As you walk out of the church, you will see what is the choir chapel of the sisters. It's where they meet daily to chant the divine office. It's a loft, rather large. It has an altar. This renovation was done in 1988. Prior to that, it looked quite different. Do you notice the windows in these photos? Our architects for our renovation, Sacred Heart Chapel, actually went to Eichstatt. We renovated our main chapel. We gutted it in 1983, and the architects went to St. Walburg. But of course, you see these windows all over Bavaria. Now, this is the upper level of what is called the shrine, and it has a lower level called the crypt. This is the tomb where the remains of St. Walburga were brought in the 9th century. And what you have here at the top are statues. The middle one is St. Walburga, and the others are members of her family. Both her mother and her father are represented here. There's a strong devotion, almost a kind of positive cult toward this saint in Bavarian Christian history. That's a closer look. This is a great shot that Carol Johannes took. I love this one, and you can see what is a rather typical motif in images of St. Walburga. Here's the flask with the healing oil. This is looking down from the upper level to the lower level. Above this are the statues that we just saw. There's an altar in the lower level, and this would be the area where the remains are located, the bones that were transferred from Heidenheim. Now, on the walls all around on this lower level are testimonies to healing. It is thought that this seepage from the bones of St. Walburga, this is the way the history goes, I want to get this right. About a century after her death, when she was still buried in Heidenheim, we're talking about 9th century, and at the point that her remains were being transferred from Heidenheim to Eichstatt, they noticed that clear water drops were on the bones when they opened the tomb. And the claim at that time, it's believed up to the present day, is that this water flow happens every year between beginning in November until the end of February. And it came to be thought to have healing powers. So it's been part of the tradition of honoring and venerating St. Walburga. And it's become a real pilgrimage. People who use this Walburga oil, they collect it. The sisters collect it and they bottle it in little vials. And they don't sell it. Because Michaela Moore said, over my dead body will I sell some sacred oil or healing water. But they give it away very, very generously. And people use it when they're ill and when they're sick. And then these are memorials that they give to the sisters as testimony to the power and the healing. They're very interesting to look at, to read. Here's another. They even tell their story by giving a mold of a leg or some limb or some part of the body that was healed through the power of St. Walburga. Now, you're probably not going to see, those of you who are going and those of you who have been there, you're probably not going to see the next few slides. This is the inner area of the sisters' residence. Each one of them has a private room along hallways that look like this. Did any of you get in there from the previous tours? Did you get in to see the sisters' residence? Okay. This is their dining room. Did anybody get into the dining room? This is an older picture of their dining room. They've done a little renovation, mostly painting, and a better picture would show some of the paintings on the walls in their dining room. This is just a shot of a group in the dining room. Not a good picture, but one of their main ministries, they still staff, or they have sisters working in the city school of Eichstatt, but they built a kindergarten probably about 35 years ago on their property, and they have a rather large kindergarten, which is their ministry. I loved visiting the little children. And this was the sister who was working in the kindergarten, you know, kind of a child herself, who I'm sure the children loved. I don't know, did anybody get to the cemetery? I guess they don't take visitors back there because that's part of the enclosure, but they let me in. It's really a beautiful place, and of course the monastery is up against the mountainside. But what I'm so impressed with in the cemeteries in Europe, Bavaria, and then in Wahl, Bavaria, a little village where Mother Benedict was born, they have gardens. Their grave sites are gardens. So I came back after my first visit, no, it was my second visit, in Wahl, and said Benedict whose remains, whose grave site is in our monastery cemetery, has to have a garden. So as long as I'm able, she will have a garden in the summer. So when you come back, or if the snow ever leaves, during the summer and early fall, there'll be flowers on Mother Benedict Reed's grave site. But I loved, well, I'm a cemetery buff as a historian. This is a gift shop. And you'll certainly get into that, right? You can be sure of that. I love this sculpture in the museum. Do you get to the museum? Would be a good place to ask about. But this is a sculpture depicting St. Walburga and her background of nobility. It's a lovely, lovely piece.
Try to squeeze that in, Chick.
What's that?
Try to squeeze that into the tour.
Yeah.
We don't have enough walking
No,
parties,
there's
so
not enough.
we're
You're
more-
gonna have almost 2 full days. That's quite right? Now here's Abbess Francisca, and this photo was taken 20 years ago when I first met her. She has been the abbess since 1986. So since that time, she's aged 20 years, and she has almost completely lost her eyesight. She has severe macular degeneration. It doesn't seem to have dampened her spirits, right? No, it doesn't seem to. Okay, because I noticed that she was a favorite that people photographed, because here are a few. Here she is. Carol Johannes took these photos of her. There are tons of them in that collection. I have, the next slide are yours. No, these are Dora's. Okay. Aren't they great? And she has a very infectious laugh. Very infectious.
She winked at me during Mass.
She winked at you?
Has anybody else been able to go in for Mass like our group did in 11? And she's walking out, winked right at me.
Yeah, and she hugs you all goodbye, doesn't she?
Yeah, she does.
They all get a big bear hug. She's about like
She's so precious.
a little bit of the city, the environment of the city. This is the town square. In the background is the cathedral of Eichstatt. I don't know if that's on the tour for this coming year.
More than likely.
More than likely, okay. Just what the environments look like. This is the image at the top appears to be Joseph holding the child Jesus with a little world in its hand. This is a closer picture. German Catholics have great devotion to St. Joseph. This is a great picture, Chip, showing the prominence of the cathedral spires.
When you were laying in the asphalt.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, she was thinking around. This is a postcard, but the interior main altar is very splendid. I know some of you have to leave. The stained glass windows. Here's the Remy glass, again, in the honeycomb image in the cathedral. This is the architecture in the cathedral, and the sculptures and the paintings are just spectacular. This is one of the hallways around the main cathedral. Architecture. I'm talking about architecture within the old city of Eichstatt. Almost done. Kind of a typical shot. Carol took this one in a street in the old part of the city. The market. St. Boniface, statue in the middle, the patron saint of Germany. And of course there is the food,
Oh, yeah.
and there is the beer. This one I think is at the Hofbrauhaus, right? Anybody here who remembers that one? And the ice cream. The ice cream. Now, just a few of my own pictures, just 5 of them, and then I'm going to be finished. I celebrated my 50th birthday in Eichstatt. And these 2 young women were volunteers at the Abbey. And the morning of my birthday, somebody told them it was my birthday. They went down to the river Uphill and they picked wildflowers and presented me with a bouquet of wildflowers. It was a very memorable, for many reasons, 50th birthday. And Sister Eunice, some of you know her, was traveling with me that year. Another picture of Sister Eunice and I with some of the sisters. These are old throwaway camera, non-digital pictures. Yeah, right. This is one of my favorites because this is in a cemetery at the grave marker of Mother Edvarda Schnitzer, who sent the first 3 sisters to America. So she's something of a saint to me. And then I mentioned the ice cream. Karen on this picture is a colleague of mine from Fordham University who was traveling with me. And I confess, when the sisters would go to pray matins at night, we would go down the steps, and I think we hit every ice cream shop in the city in the period of time we were there. Just so fantastic. And that's it. I apologize if that was more than you bargained for, but that was all great. Yeah, and if you can stay, if you have questions, or if you want to tell some stories.
Where is that photo taken?
Well, that's along one of the streets. Some other people on the tours had had their pictures taken in that niche. I know. So I had seen one of them, but I couldn't find it when I wanted to put it in. But we were just sort of fooling around. And I said, well, I'd fit in there. Yeah.
Maybe this is a dumb question, but I know American sisters don't wear habits, but the German sisters choose to wear habits. Is that a monastery thing, or is it a German thing, or what's the?
Yeah, it is a European style, and of course, many changes took place in our way of life in this country, beginning with the mandate in Vatican Council II to simplify our dress. And so we went through a number of stages until it seemed like the ordinary dress of people was a better way of connecting. You know, our American culture is a little more informal. We have a different history. We have a frontier history. There are many reasons for it. But I have to tell you, when I first started my research, and when I went to St. Walburg's for the first time, I was received real coolly. And I was wearing black and white. I wasn't wearing a veil, but I was wearing. But they had not had much contact with American sisters, and especially my interest in their history and in Mother Benedict made them wonder, you know, what's this about? Why is she interested in doing this history? It took a while for things to warm up. I think part of the way Abbess Francisca greets you folks today has to do with a larger number of American sisters visiting there since the 1980s, and she really feels connected. She's no longer able to come to this country. We invited her for our 150th anniversary in 2007, and she couldn't travel because of her eyesight, but she's very hospitable and really loves to have visitors who are connected with American sisters. So I think the dress was one piece of it, but there hadn't been much contact because they are still considered semi-enclosed, even though they do work in the school. But it took some ice breaking. Yeah.
Do you know if the sisters from the other Benedictine monasteries in the United States are as active in visiting as ours are?
I think so. I think more and more monasteries are sponsoring tours for the monastery, even if they don't have a college or a university. But those of us in that chart who were founded directly from St. Mary's, Pennsylvania, tend to have a closer connection and interest in that history.
Just a trivia question, but the saint's name is Walburga and the abbey is Walburg.
Yeah.
Is that just a German thing?
Right.
I thought I wrote it down wrong. Since I'm going this year, I thought I should get it.
Yeah, that's the way they spell it on in their materials.
Okay.
Yes.
Is Eichstatt a relatively large or medium or small city? Is it?
I think it's small, relatively small. I could only guess at the population. I should have looked that up.
Very
Oh. Those of you who have been there, would you say
Yeah.
small, friendly city?
Small like St. Joe or small like St. Paul?
In between.
St. Cloud.
St. Cloud,
St.
maybe,
Cloud.
yeah. Almost everything's within walking distance, at least in that part. Yes. All the ice cream shops are within walking distance.
But that's the only Catholic university.
Yes, there's only one Catholic university in the whole of Europe. Excuse me, in Germany, and Eichstatt has it. There are Catholic study departments in public universities, but there is no other Catholic-sponsored university in Germany. So it's pretty unique.
What is it called?
I was going to put a slide in. I think just the University of Eichstatt, if I remember correctly. I copied tons of stuff in their library, but I didn't pay too much attention to the details. Well, thank you very much. You've been very gracious.